Imagine for a moment someone who is deeply flawed, a person who makes mistakes, causes harm, and is caught in a web of deception, someone who, despite it all, ends up becoming the father of an entire nation. It sounds impossible, right? Yet that's exactly what happened in the Bible with a man named Jacob. What if I told you that God didn't just use Jacob despite his flaws, but through them? What if his very imperfections were the key to the incredible transformation that would not only change his life, but the fate of an entire people? Jacob is one of the most human characters in the entire Bible. His story is filled with twists, turns, and moments that could easily fit into any drama. But here's the thing. His journey isn't just about deception and struggle. It's also about redemption, transformation, and faith. And honestly, that's what makes his story so relatable to us today. We all face moments where we're forced to wrestle with our own shortcomings, our own doubts, and our own challenges. But what if, just like Jacob, we could emerge from those struggles stronger, more faithful, and ready to step into something bigger than ourselves? Jacob's life wasn't one of smooth sailing. It was a constant battle, literally and figuratively. From the moment he was born, grasping onto his twin brother Esau's heel, Jacob's story was a fight for position, for recognition, for blessings that weren't originally meant for him. But even in those moments of deception, even in his darkest hours, God had a plan for Jacob, one that would unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. Think about it. There was that moment when Jacob tricked his blind father into giving him a blessing meant for Esau, his older twin. It was a desperate, deceitful act that created a ripple effect of tension, anger, and ultimately a long separation from his family. Yet somehow, this act was part of the larger picture that God was painting. Jacob didn't deserve the blessing. It wasn't his birthright. But it's in these raw, human moments where we feel we're failing, where we take shortcuts, where we try to control the outcome, that God shows up. And then there's the night Jacob wrestled with God. Yes, you heard that right. Jacob literally wrestled with God. This wasn't a metaphor, a parable, or a lesson in submission. It was an all-night, physical, knock-down, drag-out struggle, one that left Jacob with a limp, but also with a new name and a fresh sense of purpose. Imagine that, wrestling with God himself, not as a symbol of submission, but as a symbol of the fight we all go through when we're desperate for answers, for a new direction, for a transformation that feels impossible. That wrestling match changed everything for Jacob. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the encounter itself. It was about the fact that, in his most vulnerable, exhausted state, Jacob refused to let go until he received a blessing. And that's what makes his story so powerful. It's the persistence, the relentless drive to stay connected to the divine, even when the odds are against you, even when it feels like the struggle will never end. The beauty of Jacob's journey is that at the end of it all, he wasn't just the man who deceived his brother. He wasn't just the guy who tricked his father for a blessing. He wasn't even just the man who wrestled with God. No, Jacob became Israel, the father of 12 sons, each of whom would become the leader of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And in doing so, he set the stage for an entire nation to be born. He didn't become the father of a nation because he was perfect. He became the father of a nation because he was willing to struggle, to fight, to wrestle, and to ultimately open himself to the transforming power of God. Jacob's story is one of redemption. It's a story that shows us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how many mistakes we make, God can still work through us. And that's a message that resonates deeply, not just for people of faith, but for anyone who's ever felt unworthy, imperfect, or like they're constantly stumbling. Jacob's flaws didn't disqualify him from God's purpose. In fact, they were part of the very thing that made him the right person for the job. Think about it. Sometimes we can be so hard on ourselves when we mess up, when we take the wrong turn, when we think we've failed. But Jacob's life teaches us that failure doesn't have to be the end. The struggle is not the end of the story. It's often the beginning of something even bigger. Every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt is an opportunity for growth, for learning, and for transformation. It's through our lowest moments that we sometimes experience our greatest breakthroughs. And that's what makes Jacob's story so powerful and so relevant to us today. It's not about being perfect. It's not about getting everything right. It's about persevering through the tough times, wrestling with the challenges that come our way, and trusting that somehow, in the end, we'll be better for it. Jacob's journey shows us that God doesn't call the perfect. He calls the willing. He calls those who are ready to fight, to struggle, and to wrestle with their doubts, their fears, and their failures. And just like Jacob, if we're willing to stick it out, to stay the course, and to trust in the process, we'll find that our own struggles can lead to something much greater than we ever imagined. Jacob wasn't the man he was at the beginning of his journey by the end of it. And neither are we. The struggles we face, the battles we fight, whether they're against our circumstances, our past, or even our own flaws, can shape us into something stronger, more resilient, and more faithful than we ever thought possible. Just as Jacob transformed from a deceiver to the father of a nation, so too can we transform, growing into the people we're meant to be. And here's the thing, the story of Jacob doesn't end there. It's part of a much bigger narrative. His life was a stepping stone for something grander. The nation he fathered would go on to play a crucial role in the history of the world. But all of that, the redemption, the transformation, the faith, started with a man who was flawed, imperfect, and deeply human. So, the next time you're feeling like you're not enough, like your flaws are too big to overcome, remember Jacob. Remember that in the struggle, in the messiness of life, is where God often shows up most powerfully. Your imperfections don't define you. They're the very thing that can lead you to your purpose. Keep fighting, keep wrestling, and know that, just like Jacob, you can be transformed into something greater than you ever thought possible. Stay tuned, because in the coming episodes, we'll dive even deeper into the lives of more biblical figures whose journeys might just surprise you and inspire you to embrace your own struggles with faith, hope, and perseverance. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation and redemption. Imagine this. You've just been born into a world where the destiny of your entire family rests on your shoulders. Your very identity is intertwined with a legacy, a promise, and an inheritance that will shape not only your future, but also the future of generations to come. Now, picture that same world in conflict, where two brothers, born within minutes of each other, are destined for greatness, but not equally. This is the story of Jacob and Esau, and it all starts with their birth. Jacob and Esau weren't just any ordinary twins. They came into the world with a prophetic promise that set them on a path of rivalry and struggle long before they even took their first steps. Their father, Isaac, was the son of Abraham, the man who God had made an extraordinary promise to, the father of many nations. But Isaac's family wasn't without its own challenges. Isaac and his wife, Rebekah, had been childless for many years before God blessed them with these twin boys. And even before their birth, God had already spoken of the kind of men they would become and of the destiny that lay before them. While still in Rebekah's womb, God gave her a strange and prophetic message. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. God told her that the older son, Esau, would serve the younger one, Jacob. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry. This was about a divine plan unfolding, one that would flip the natural order of things on its head. In that culture, the firstborn son was the one who received the greatest blessing, the birthright. It meant leadership of the family, a double portion of the inheritance, and most importantly, it carried with it the spiritual blessing, the promise that would pass from Abraham to Isaac, and now to the firstborn. So, the stage was set for a dramatic clash. From the moment they were born, Jacob and Esau couldn't have been more different. Esau came out first, red and hairy, a man's man, rugged and strong. He was the hunter, the outdoorsman, the one who was built for physical labor and adventure. Meanwhile, Jacob came out holding on to Esau's heel, a more calculated and inwardly focused individual. He was quieter, more reserved, and spent his time around the tents, content to stay home, think things through, and bide his time. Even though they were twins, their personalities couldn't have been more opposite. But the contrast wasn't just about temperament. It also reflected the very future that God had in mind for them. Esau, the older of the 2, was meant to be the leader, the one who would inherit the blessing. Jacob, on the other hand, was destined to receive it, but not in the way anyone would expect. The first major flashpoint between the 2 brothers happened when Esau, after a long day of hunting, came home famished. Jacob, ever the opportunist, had just made a pot of stew. Esau, desperate for food, asked his brother for a bowl. And this is where we see the first real glimpse of Jacob's character and his willingness to take advantage of his brother's weakness. Jacob saw an opportunity. Without hesitation, he told Esau that he would only give him some stew in exchange for his birthright. That's right. Jacob asked his hungry, exhausted brother to trade the entire inheritance and blessing of their father for something as trivial as a bowl of soup. And, remarkably, Esau agreed. He was so desperate, so consumed by his immediate hunger, that he sold his future for something temporary and fleeting. In the moment, Esau's decision seemed foolish. Who would give up something as valuable as their birthright for a meal? But here's the thing. It wasn't just about the stew. This exchange was about a deeper issue. Esau didn't value his birthright as much as he should have. He was impulsive, driven by momentary needs, and careless with his long-term blessings. And Jacob, well, he knew exactly what he was doing. He had been waiting for this moment. Jacob didn't just want the birthright. He believed he deserved it. Maybe it was because he'd been second all his life, always living in Esau's shadow. Maybe it was because he felt like he had to grab what was rightfully his before Esau could take it all for granted. Whatever his reasons, this moment marked the beginning of a pattern that would define Jacob's life. His willingness to manipulate and deceive in order to secure what he felt was his. Now let's pause for a second and think about the significance of what Jacob took from Esau. In ancient times, the birthright was about so much more than just wealth. It was about leadership, being the head of the family, the one who would carry the legacy forward. It was about spiritual authority, the very blessings that had been passed down through the generations, from Abraham to Isaac. And it wasn't just a legal or material matter. It was sacred, a symbol of divine favor. By taking the birthright, Jacob wasn't just gaining wealth or influence. He was essentially stepping into the shoes of a leader, the one who would be responsible for continuing God's covenant with his people. But Jacob wasn't just thinking about the birthright in spiritual terms. He was thinking about his own future, his own security, and in that moment, he believed that this was the way to ensure his place in the family and in the world. He knew that he had to take what he felt was owed to him. Whether his actions were morally right or wrong didn't matter to him at that point. He was focused on the result, the end game. This act of deception wasn't a one-time thing. It was just the beginning of a pattern that would follow Jacob for much of his life. He was willing to bend the rules, to manipulate situations, and to take risks in order to get what he thought he deserved. And yet, as we'll see later in his story, the consequences of these actions would be far-reaching, setting off a chain of events that would eventually lead to Jacob wrestling with God, seeking redemption, and transforming into someone entirely different. But before we get there, let's take a moment to reflect on what this story means for us. Jacob's decision to deceive his brother teaches us something important about human nature. We've all had moments when we've acted impulsively, when we've made decisions based on immediate needs or desires, and in doing so, we've risked something greater. Whether it's compromising our values, sacrificing relationships, or making decisions that ultimately don't serve us in the long run, we've all been in situations where we've chosen what's easy over what's right. And like Esau, we sometimes don't realize the full cost of those choices until much later. Jacob's story isn't just one of manipulation and deceit. It's also one of learning, growing, and realizing that the things we take for granted, the blessings we don't value, can be lost forever. It's a reminder that the decisions we make, especially when we're driven by short-term needs, can have long-lasting consequences. In the end, Jacob's birthright betrayal is a pivotal moment in his life, a moment that sets him on a journey of self-discovery, struggle, and eventually redemption. It's a reminder that even when we mess up, even when we take the wrong path, there's always an opportunity for change, growth, and transformation. And for Jacob, that change would come, but only after a long and difficult road. So what did Jacob's birthright betrayal teach us? That sometimes what seems like a small decision can alter the course of our lives. It's a story about the choices we make, the consequences that follow, and the deep human desire to take control of our own destiny, even when it means taking shortcuts. And as we continue to walk through Jacob's journey, we'll see how these early decisions shaped the man he would become, and how his story ultimately points to the power of redemption and transformation. Family dynamics can be incredibly complex, and nowhere is that more evident than in the story of Jacob, Esau, and their parents, Isaac and Rebekah. We've already seen how Jacob's natural tendencies led him to manipulate his brother Esau for the birthright. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, things take an even darker turn when we see how Jacob's mother, Rebekah, played a pivotal role in a deception that would change the course of their family forever. This time, the stakes were even higher. The blessing, the spiritual inheritance, the very thing that defined a man's future. And Jacob, with his mother's guidance, was about to steal it. Rebekah wasn't just a passive figure in the background of Jacob's life. She was his collaborator in one of the most infamous deceptions in the Bible. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you might already know that Jacob's blessing wasn't his birthright to take. It was meant for Esau, the firstborn, but Rebekah had her own agenda. She loved Jacob dearly and had been told by God, even before they were born, that the older would serve the younger. So, she believed that Jacob, not Esau, should be the one to receive Isaac's blessing. This wasn't just about favoritism. Rebekah felt that it was her divine duty to ensure that the prophecy came true. But in doing so, she planted the seeds for a family tragedy. Imagine the scene. Isaac, now an old man, blind and frail, knows his time is coming to an end. It's time to pass on his blessing, the spiritual inheritance, the promise that had been handed down from Abraham. And Isaac, perhaps reflecting the patriarchal traditions of his time, was ready to give that blessing to Esau, his eldest son, the one he loved for his strength and hunting skills. But Rebekah, overhearing Isaac's plans, knew she had to act fast. She had to make sure Jacob received the blessing. Her beloved son, the one she believed would carry forward the promise. Rebekah's plan was simple, but treacherous. She called Jacob to her and told him of Isaac's intentions. "Your father is going to bless Esau, but you must go to him and deceive him. Take some of Esau's clothes, make your voice sound like his, and cook the savory meal that Isaac loves so much. Your father will give you the blessing, thinking you are Esau." Jacob, however, wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. He had no doubt that he was capable of trickery. After all, he'd already taken Esau's birthright for a bowl of stew. But this was different. This wasn't just a family disagreement or a quick bargain. This was a full-on deception of his father, Isaac, a man who had been the spiritual leader of the family, a man who was deeply respected, even revered. What Jacob was being asked to do was to impersonate his brother completely, physically, vocally, and emotionally. Jacob hesitated. "But, Mother, what if my father touches me? Esau is hairy, and I am smooth-skinned. What if he realizes I'm not Esau?" Rebekah, determined and unrelenting, had already thought of that. She took goat skins and draped them over Jacob's hands and neck, so that when Isaac felt him, he would think he was Esau. And as for the meal, Rebekah made sure it was just the way Isaac liked it. Jacob, though nervous, complied. He was about to do something that would change everything. Jacob entered Isaac's room, pretending to be Esau. He tried to mask his voice, though it didn't come naturally. Isaac, with his limited sight, asked, "Who is it?" "Esau." Jacob answered, "Yes, it's Esau." The tension in the room must have been suffocating. Isaac, still not completely convinced, asked Jacob to come closer so he could touch him. As Isaac felt Jacob's hands, covered in goat skin, he murmured to himself, "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's." And yet Jacob's persistence and Rebekah's careful manipulation worked. Isaac, now believing that this was indeed his son Esau, blessed him. This moment, though brief, was a monumental turning point. Jacob had now stolen the very thing that wasn't his to take. the blessing that carried with it the future of the family. By the time Isaac realized what had happened, it was too late. The words of the blessing were already spoken. Jacob, the younger son, now had the covenant of Abraham and Isaac. But what was going through Jacob's mind during this deception? Was he fully aware of the gravity of his actions? Did he understand the lasting impact it would have on his family? We can only imagine the internal conflict Jacob must have felt. On one hand, this blessing was everything he had ever wanted. It was his claim to leadership, to the promise of God. But on the other hand, he knew that this moment would cause irreparable damage to his relationship with Esau. The two brothers, who had already been divided over the birthright, were now torn apart forever by this act of betrayal. Jacob's mind must have been racing with anxiety, even guilt. Was the blessing really worth it? Would he ever be able to live with the consequences of his deception? The Bible doesn't give us a clear answer to these questions, but we can imagine the emotional strain Jacob must have experienced. This wasn't a simple lie. It was a lie with eternal consequences, one that would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Esau's reaction to the theft of the blessing was nothing short of devastating. When Esau returned from his hunting trip and learned what had happened, the Bible says he cried out with a loud and bitter cry, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." He begged, realizing that his blessing had been taken from him. But Isaac could do nothing. The blessing had already been given to Jacob, and no amount of pleading would change it. Esau's grief wasn't just about losing his inheritance. It was about the broken trust, the sense of betrayal by both his brother and his mother. This wasn't just a minor family dispute. It was a wound that cut deep into Esau's heart. The relationship between the two brothers was shattered, and the rift between them would never fully heal. Esau's anger was so intense that he even vowed to kill Jacob once their father died. The tension, the conflict, the heartache, it was all the result of one moment of deception, one act of dishonesty that Jacob, driven by his own desires and with his mother's guidance, had set into motion. The consequences of Jacob's actions were immediate and profound. The bond between him and his brother was broken. The trust that had existed in their family was fractured beyond repair. And even though Jacob had received the blessing he so desperately wanted, it came with a price, one that would follow him for years to come. Jacob's deception of Isaac is a story of the complex dynamics of family, of love, and of the choices that define us. Rebekah's role in this scheme was both protective and manipulative. She wanted to ensure Jacob's future, but in doing so, she sowed the seeds of conflict and distrust. Jacob, in his pursuit of what he believed he deserved, set in motion a chain of events that would leave a trail of emotional wreckage behind him. This story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes, in our desire to achieve something we think we deserve, we forget the cost of our actions. Jacob may have gained the blessing, but he lost much more. His relationship with his brother, his sense of peace, and the trust of those closest to him. In the end, his deception did not bring him the lasting fulfillment he sought. It brought him turmoil, conflict, and the need for transformation. And as we'll see, Jacob's journey wasn't over yet. The road ahead would be long, filled with struggles and lessons that would eventually lead to the moment of redemption he so desperately needed. But for now, the consequences of his actions loomed large, and the story of the stolen blessing would continue to shape the man he would become. Jacob's life, as we've seen, is one filled with twists, turns, and moments of tension. But the consequences of his earlier deceit were now starting to catch up with him. After tricking his father Isaac and stealing Esau's blessing, Jacob found himself in a precarious position. His brother Esau was furious, so much so that he vowed to kill Jacob. Faced with the looming threat of his brother's wrath, Jacob's mother Rebekah acted swiftly to protect him. She sent him away to her brother Laban's house in Haran, far from Esau's reach. But how must Jacob have felt, knowing that his actions had led him to this point? He was forced to leave the family he had deceived, the very people who had loved him, to escape the consequences of his choices. The betrayal of his brother, his mother's role in the deceit, and the looming uncertainty about his future all weighed on him. Jacob wasn't just fleeing Esau's anger, he was fleeing the brokenness he had caused in his own life. This was not just a physical journey, but a soul-deep one. His escape was a painful acknowledgement that his decisions had consequences. Even though he was now on the run, Jacob couldn't escape his inner turmoil. He had deceived and manipulated to get ahead, but now he was forced to leave behind everything familiar, everything he had once taken for granted, all because of his choices. This exile marked the beginning of a deeper journey, a journey of transformation and redemption that Jacob would not see coming. As Jacob journeyed, weary and burdened by his past, he arrived at a place called Bethel. There, alone, he lay down to rest, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of his life. It was in this moment, isolated from the comforts and familiarity of home, that Jacob had a life-changing dream, a dream that would set him on a new path. In his dream, Jacob saw a ladder stretching from the earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it. The vision was powerful and surreal, but its significance went far beyond the imagery. As Jacob watched in awe, God spoke to him, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac." God said, "I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying, and your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you." Genesis 28:13-15. This wasn't just a dream about angels or a mysterious ladder. It was a divine promise. God was reaffirming his covenant with Jacob, just as he had done with Abraham and Isaac. This was not just a random vision. It was God's declaration that Jacob's journey, though marked by struggle and deception, would serve a greater purpose. God's plan for him was still intact, and through Jacob the promise made to Abraham would continue. What makes this moment so powerful is that Jacob, who had spent so much of his life scheming, lying, and trying to control his own destiny, was now on the receiving end of God's unmerited grace. God wasn't offering Jacob a conditional promise based on his actions. No, this was a promise rooted in God's faithfulness. Even though Jacob had manipulated and deceived, God was still committed to him and his plan for his life. In response to this dream, Jacob made a vow to God. "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, then the Lord will be my God." Genesis 28:20-22. It was a vow of trust, but it also reflected a deep sense of gratitude for the grace Jacob had received. He was acknowledging that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was choosing to place his trust in God. In this moment, Jacob's spiritual awakening began. The journey that had started with deception and fear was now beginning to turn toward faith and trust in God. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, Jacob was about to face even more challenges that would test his character. This was where his next major trial would unfold, life with his uncle Laban. And if Jacob thought he could outsmart Laban, he was in for a rude awakening. Laban, it turns out, was just as deceptive as Jacob had been. In fact, Jacob might have met his match. When Jacob arrived in Haran, he immediately fell in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. He agreed to work for 7 years in exchange for her hand in marriage. 7 years might sound like a long time, but Jacob was so in love that the years passed quickly. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, Jacob was excited, but to his horror, Laban tricked him, switching his daughters and giving him Leah, the older sister, instead of Rachel. Imagine Jacob's shock. He had been deceived in the same way he had deceived his own father and brother. His reaction must have been a mix of anger, betrayal, and helplessness. What followed was another 7 years of work, this time for Rachel. But Jacob was no longer just a victim of deceit. He was also a master of it. He learned from Laban, mirroring his uncle's manipulative tactics in his dealings with the flocks. Jacob's time with Laban was a difficult one, but it also forced him to confront the kind of man he had become, and the cost of his deceitful ways. Jacob's time in Haran wasn't just about material gain or outsmarting Laban. It was also a period of soul-searching. The more Jacob engaged in manipulation and deception, the more he began to see the emptiness in it all. His inner turmoil grew as he faced the reality that he had become what he once despised. It wasn't until later, after many struggles, that Jacob would come to terms with his past actions and undergo a transformation that would change the course of his life. That transformation began with a remarkable encounter at Peniel, where Jacob would finally confront his own identity and the man he had been. Jacob's encounter with a mysterious figure that night would mark the beginning of the end of his old self and the start of a new chapter, a chapter that would lead to his ultimate reconciliation and the fulfillment of the promise God had given him. At Peniel, Jacob wrestled with the figure all night. The wrestling wasn't just physical, it was symbolic of his internal battle with his past, his flaws, and the path he had walked. And in the end, Jacob's name was changed from Jacob, which means deceiver, to Israel, which means he struggles with God. This change of name was a declaration that Jacob's identity was no longer defined by his past actions or by his attempts to manipulate others. He was no longer just a deceiver. He was a man who had struggled with God and had come through it, transformed and ready to lead a nation. This moment at Peniel was the turning point in Jacob's life. He was no longer the same man who had deceived his brother and father. The transformation had begun, and it would continue through the difficult reconciliation he would face with Esau, the very brother he had once betrayed. But as we'll see, the reconciliation between Jacob and Esau would be a moment of grace, healing, and the ultimate sign that Jacob's journey had come full circle. The story of Jacob is a powerful reminder that our past does not have to define our future. Even when we struggle with our own flaws and mistakes, God's grace is always there, ready to redeem and restore. Jacob's journey from deception to transformation shows us that no matter how lost we may feel, God can still use us to fulfill His purpose, just as He did with Jacob. As we look back on Jacob's journey, we see a story that mirrors the struggles, flaws, and transformation we all experience in our own lives. Jacob started as a man defined by deception. He manipulated his brother, deceived his father, and ran from his past, carrying the weight of guilt and fear with him wherever he went. His story was one of constant struggle against his family, against his own nature, and even against God Himself. But through it all, one thing remained true: God's unwavering faithfulness. Jacob's transformation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a simple change of heart or a sudden realization. It took years of mistakes, of running, of being confronted with his own deception, and of wrestling with God. But in the end, it was precisely through those struggles, through the wrestling, through the moments of brokenness, that Jacob found redemption. His story is a testament to the fact that no matter how flawed or broken we may feel, God is still at work, still using us for His purposes, still offering us the chance to become who He created us to be. As we reflect on Jacob's journey, it's worth asking ourselves, how can we relate to his flaws, his struggles, and his path toward redemption? Maybe we've made decisions in the past that we regret, or maybe we've wrestled with our own sense of identity or our purpose. Jacob's life reminds us that our flaws do not disqualify us from God's love or His calling. Instead, they may be the very things that God uses to shape us into the people He wants us to become. And perhaps the most powerful part of Jacob's story is the reminder that God often chooses the most unlikely people to fulfill His purposes. Jacob was flawed, deceitful, and sometimes downright selfish. Yet through him, God established the nation of Israel, one that would go on to play a crucial role in His redemptive plan for the world. What does it mean that God chose someone like Jacob? It means that no matter how flawed we feel, no matter how unworthy we think we are, God's grace is bigger than our shortcomings. He can and will use us to fulfill His purpose, even when we don't see it ourselves. So, as you reflect on Jacob's story, I encourage you to think about your own journey. How is God working in your life? What struggles or mistakes have you faced that might be leading to something greater? Jacob's story shows us that transformation is possible, and redemption is always within reach, no matter where we're starting from. If you've been inspired by Jacob's journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you see his story connecting with your own? What lessons can we take from Jacob's life as we face our own struggles and seek God's redemption in our lives? Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful, share it with anyone who might need some encouragement, and subscribe for more insights into the lives of Bible figures like Jacob. And if you'd like to dive deeper into Jacob's journey, leave a comment below. I'd love to continue the conversation with you. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter what your past looks like, God's grace is always there, ready to transform you into something greater.